Hi everybody. This is my talk. It's about logging, it's about operations, it's about, in a way, continuous delivery. I'm Sean, I work here, which is actually also here. I'm on Twitter. And first a little note, you're going to hear me talking about ranting is probably a better word, about logging a lot, but I firmly believe that almost all of this holds for all kinds of operations code. It holds for metrics and monitoring, deployment tools, utilities. It's just that logging is my personal pet peeve, and it's probably the one area where I've actually done even anything about it. So if you hear logging, a lot of the time it's true for operations infrastructure in general. Second disclosure. I don't do much ops, I'm a dev, and there's a note here in my presenter notes that says pause for booze. If I'm being honest with myself, I don't do full-time support. I'm never on call, but I have a lot of respect for people who do. And in a way, I think it kind of counts for something when someone who identifies fully as a developer says developers don't treat people in operations well enough. I think that counts for something a little better. So I like starting this talk with that little admission. Who here's an Agile software developer? Who here considers themselves an Agile developer? Or, in the Agile universe? Okay. So a good percentage of the crowd, at least some. And those of us who are experienced Agile developers have a pretty decent understanding of how an Agile feature is built. I mean, first you identify a customer need, and you design the feature ideally with a customer representative, and you write a feature story. This is something like, as a user to this application, I would like to be able to log in so I can identify myself to the application so that I can see my stuff and nobody else can see my stuff unless I let them, or something like that. But the feature isn't write a login page, it's write a login page from a user's point of view. And so we're always trying to do something for a user. So we identify a customer need, we design it with a customer in mind, ideally in a perfect world with a customer in the room. We write a feature story from the customer's point of view. We prioritize the feature. The product owner prioritizes this feature compared to all the other ones and decides it's important to do first or if it can wait a little bit. Then we do a YAGNI check. YAGNI stands for you ain't gonna need it. And a key sign is if you're saying, well, we may do this later on, YAGNI. Anytime you say we may do this, you ain't gonna need it. If we will definitely do this, or we are doing this right now, then we can go ahead. Then the feature is tested. Then the feature is developed. Yes, these steps are in order. Then the feature is refactored, and often those last three happen over and over again, mercilessly in a very tight loop, until we think we're finished. And the feature is demoed to a customer representative. And then the team as a whole decides that the feature is done. And then the feature is deployed to production. And then we gather feedback on the feature and how it's working, how well it's doing, do we need to tweak it? And sometimes the feature is updated or tweaked or changed through this entire process over again. And then sometimes the feature is decommissioned and removed because we don't need it anymore. And in my experience, logging is one of the many things that's never treated this way. And why not? I'm guessing that most of you are in a sort of a delivery operations sort of standpoint or mindset. How many of you have ever seen a logging feature or a story treated this way through this kind of process? There's one lonely hand at the back. How many of you have even seen logging treated as a feature or a story at all? 2 other hands, 3 other hands, but a distinct minority. And my question to you guys is, why the heck not? I mean, why is it special? Why is it different? Why is it the magical thing, the one magical thing that can't be done this way? Everything else under the sun is developed this way, and it works for incredibly complex, incredibly powerful stuff. This isn't special enough to warrant not going through this process. I find in my experience that what happens instead is feature stories aren't written at all, which is code for somebody just adds something. And what something do they add? Well, in practice, that ends up being whatever the random developer who's working on it at the minute decides might be best. And they don't know because they didn't talk to the people that are going to use it, because the stories aren't tied to any particular customer. It's just, I've decided that the application should log this when this happens. Why? Because I decided. Who are you to decide? You wouldn't do that with the login page. Why are you doing that here? They also aren't prioritized. And worse than that, not prioritized is usually code for actively deprioritized. It usually means done at the end. Done at the end in a giant bloody panic 3 days before going live, because someone in operations has come up and basically threatened you with bodily harm if you don't give them some way of maintaining this, this monstrosity that you've built in production. So, oh yeah, we better add some logging in. Or, so usually if there was a story at all, the story would be do some stuff to make operations happy. Or if operations is powerful enough, operations won't let us take this live until we do some stuff to make them happy. So go do some stuff to make operations happy. Just shut them up. And that's not right. These stories are never, that I've seen, subjected to a Yagni check. And the really funny thing about this is that the software developers that consider themselves the most diligent often sin the most here, because quite often they write way too much logging code. Or they log the wrong things, or they log the wrong information because they're trying to help, but they didn't ask, and there's been no systematic analysis of what do we need. So often the littlest things are logged to death, and then what happens is even if 1 in 100 of them is the right thing, you're drowning in log statements and you got to find it, and now you're looking for a needle in a pile of needles. And the example of that works best is the world's worst example of a log file format ever, Catalina.out, if anybody here's ever run Tomcat. The glut of well-meaning crap that spews from it. When it starts up, it's like you were digging something with a pickaxe and hit a sewer line. There's just stuff everywhere. And very little of it's useful. And even if it is useful, it's useless because there's so much other useless stuff in there that you have to find. These stories are never, ever, ever tested. How many of you have ever seen a build fail because logging's not working correctly? One person. But you're doing the other presentation, so you don't count. And worse, they aren't easy to test either. And they're rarely refactored. If anyone here who does dabble in development has ever seen a log statement and realized, hey, wait a minute, that can't even happen anymore. So first of all, that's dumb. But worse, that log statement is actively lying to you. That's bad. And you know, with anything else in the computer world, if a computer's actively lying to me, whatever does it gets deleted without mercy. And I don't see why this should be different. Refactoring breaks them all the time. Anyone who's in development who's ever changed what package or namespace a logging statement is issued from, well, with log4j or any of its style, or log4net, any of its style logging outputs, you've just changed how the configuration file enables or de-enables that log statement, and I bet you didn't think of that when you moved the class across packages. You just broke your logging. And you don't know because you don't have tests. Sorry, I don't mean to be looking exactly at you. You're just in front of me. So they're rarely tested. They're rarely refactored. They're usually broken if you do refactor. They're rarely demoed. When's the last time any of you had a development team demonstrate to you the kind of log messages that could come out as part of a release or part of a sprint demo? Ever? Why not? One lonely hand again. Or, you know, when's the last time anyone who wrote logging infrastructure or operations infrastructure of any kind demoed it to the an operations team? There's no excuse for this. Feedback is gathered rarely and haphazardly, an emphasis on the word hazard. And again, they're never decommissioned properly. There's log statements in there for stuff that doesn't happen anymore. And properly, by the way, means not just deleted from the code, it means removed from the runbook, and everyone in operations is informed that this thing that used to happen doesn't happen anymore. So decommission properly in this world actually has a slightly heavier meaning than just, oh, we remembered to delete it. And if you're thinking, that sounds like a recipe for disaster, Well, in many ways, it is almost a recipe for disaster. You're logging, you're doing message logging that operations doesn't need or doesn't want. You're missing log statements that operations would want. You're not capturing the right information. More importantly, you're not making the system more reliable, and you're not making the system easier to manage, and you have an opportunity to do all of these things with logging or any kind of operations infrastructure, and it's an opportunity squandered. And it starts coping mechanisms, because generally what happens is that operation teams try to sift through what's there, do detective work to figure out what's there, add some scripts, or re-engineer something. And a textbook example of the first 2 points, I was building actually just a local development environment, but it wanted to spin up Apache Solar. I had a script that was installing and spinning up Solar and needed to see that it was started to go on to the next step. And I had to just sort of kind of trawl through their log, and at one point they just sort of did, the line that came closest was, oh, the Jetty server that this thing's hosted on, it happened to use embedded Jetty. There's a line that jetty.server.server started kind of thing. And if they ever move from using embedded Jetty to embedded Tomcat, I am well and truly pooched, because that line will change. It's just kind of there by coincidence. It's not designed to be there. They don't actually have a proper, reliable way of telling me that once I've started their server, it's actually up. And actually, sometimes it causes actual disasters. And I've got 2 anecdotes for you. A former colleague of mine who will not be named at a company who will not be named saved that company 6 figures per year of compute time purely because his team fixed a bug where it was calculating something really expensive to be used only in a log statement that was a debug level log statement, but it wasn't wrapped in an if debug enable block, and debug was turned off in production, and they ran on hundreds of thousands of servers, and they actually figured out how much it cost, and it could buy a small house in California. And another colleague who works here found a production bug because they were leaking database connections only inside of an if debug block, and they had debug logging turned off on all their QA tests and soak tests, but somebody turned it on in production in the middle of another emergency or another sort of more stressful period, turned on debug logging, and then the application started leaking database connections. And I'm pretty sure everybody was really embarrassed when they found that one. So this is stuff like, not testing this stuff can cause actual disasters, not just other actual disasters, I guess. The throw it over the wall mentality is toxic. I really believe that it's toxic. And because operations teams need to manage stuff, they don't want to manage stuff. You guys know this. You need to be able to manage and, monitor things. One thing that happens, one of the only effective things you can do is put up release gates. We're not going to deploy this to production until you provide us with this and this and this. And it means that developers resent operations. Operations resent developers. Everything spirals out of control, and there's mistrust, and then you get people sort of, it turns into an us and them mentality, and there's no good reason for that. So what works better? Collaboration, not negotiation. And the big dirty secret is that us filthy developers, we want that too. It's just that some of us don't know it yet. But the smart ones do. And we do because good developers want to release. Deep down, we all want to release, and we want as few things as possible in between us and releasing at any particular time. And that's the essence of the continuous delivery spirit, and I'm sure even this meetup, is keep as few things as possible between you hitting commit and releasing. And so a good, healthy, collaborative relationship between developers and operations is a key part of that. And certainly if you don't have it, you're just getting yourself further from what you want. So how? And it's a really stupid idea, but it seems to work. And that's just treat operations as users. And not just any users, possibly the most important users, because if you're writing a web application, your operations team is the only users that turn your application on. And I mean, heck, they do a lot more besides that, but if you don't turn the application on, it doesn't make any money. So they're the most important users. And this is more than just a prioritization technique. This should be about story acceptance. It should be about having a representative from operations present when you write the stories in the first place. This is the good old XP term of a customer proxy, except that unlike your actual customers, who you don't necessarily know about as much about them as you would like to, the customers that are in your operations team, you know exactly who they are. They're probably in the same building. Just have them send one over and talk to them about what they want. And they can actually help you write actual stories. They can be involved in testing the stories. You can demo the stories to them so that they can check that it does what they think it does and what they need it to do. And they can actually say to you, oh, it's fantastic that you've done all this work, but it's actually pretty useless. And if you're really lucky, they'll do it before you do the work in the first place. Deciding that the stories are done, of course. In my experience, the biggest difference when you start this mentality is that one story, oh, add some logging, becomes many stories. Before it's add logging. Now it's log a message when the application starts. Log a message when there's an uncaught exception that we don't understand. Log when an import job completes. Now here's an actual, these stories provide enough detail to be testable as well, which means that we can test them, and that means that you can depend on the fact that they're going to be there. You'll know exactly what's there and exactly when it's going to happen. And you can read that in a run book as well, but you'll have had someone who's in the room when they got written, so you'll really grok it rather than just be able to look it up in an encyclopedia somewhere. So here's an actual example. As operations, there's the username. As operations, I want a log entry to be written when the application starts so that I can determine how often this happens over a period of time. It's an actual requirement I got from someone. They want to be able to audit that. You know, are we restarting the application every day? Are we restarting the application every week? Are we restarting it every 180 days? We can count uptime. And the really interesting thing about that is that it kicked off a conversation, because the next thing we decided when we were talking about this, they wanted to know when the configuration changed, both for mundane reasons and for auditing. If someone was trying to hack the application and change its config files, they wanted to know about it. So the follow-up story to this was, in the message where the application is logged, let us know if the config changed. And we decided to do that by writing a hash of the config file. So the per environment config file had its hash log. We didn't want to log the exact thing in case there were passwords or sensitive things in it, but we logged the SHA hash to the config file. So if someone ever changed the application's configuration, they'd be able to find it in the audit logs. They'd be able to tell if there were two servers in one cluster that were configured differently. All this stuff comes from us having a conversation about a single log message, as opposed to just saying, oh, just add some logging, it'll be fine. So it's a small change, but it leads to a very, very different process. And doing this process a few times changed how I thought about logging pretty much entirely. So on to the really ranty part. Why is logging lousy? And it's partly because people aren't thinking of the right audience for it, but that's partly because of the tools. In the Java world, and to some extent in the .NET world as well, we use tools that were designed for the wrong customer, they were designed with the wrong features, and they're designed to do the wrong things. And the really weird thing about most of the frameworks you use in the Java land to do logging, and they're all the same, even though they're different, is that the intended user base for those is actually developers, not operations. And when you add all these things up, the honest truth is, we use the wrong tools. So the wrong features. These are all of the things that Java-based logging frameworks obsess over that you don't need. There's more, but these are them. Number one, conditional logging, the ability to change log levels on the fly. I can log at info and only some stuff will come out. I can log at error and only get the most severe things. But I can log at debug and I'll see absolutely everything. And there's this sort of assumption that at this point is just almost magical in nature, that somehow if you turn on debug logging, it will solve all of your problems. And the honest truth is, changing log levels on the fly in your application, you don't need it. Even if you do need it, if you've got an elk stack then you don't need it, because you actually just turn it on in your elk stack. You log everything and you filter it afterwards. And you can configure an elk stack pretty easily to throw away unimportant messages after an hour and keep important messages for a year. You don't need your application to do it. If you're practicing continuous delivery, then you really, really don't need it, because why would you change a config file? You just redeploy the application. If you're practicing idempotent server configuration, you absolutely can't have it, because you're not changing a configuration on a server once you've deployed it. You're redeploying. End of. And worst of all, if you're doing an audit log for something, you should be absolutely terrified of this feature, because no matter what you do, if you're audit logging, some idiot can change a production configuration file and turn your audit log off. And usually when that happens, you get into regulatory trouble. And there's no trouble like regulatory trouble. But the honest truth is, if you have a production problem, turning on debug logging won't help. People think it will help. It'll help. I'm going to have a problem, and debug logging will help with my problem. Well, what problem? Do you know about this problem ahead of time? Did you plan what goes into these debug statements that are going to help you with the problem, or is it just going to magically be there because a bunch of developers with whom you didn't discuss what's in the debug statements will just know exactly what to do to solve your problem 6 weeks ahead of time? Of course not. Even if there is the right stuff in there, will you be able to turn it on in time? Will you be able to turn it on in time on your production server while it's under load? If the problem is a performance problem, did you drill that? No, you didn't. It's not going to help. In real life, the odds are very, very low that turning on debug logging and doing nothing else is actually going to give you exactly the information you need to solve your problem. What's actually going to help you solve your problem is that someone's going to sneak an extra logging statement in there, either through your regular process if you can deliver really quickly, or if you can't deliver as quickly as all that, somebody's going to code ninja a change in 5 seconds and just kind of cut all the corners and push something up, and you'll take a bit of a gamble, but you'll get the information you need. But either way, real life, it's going in via a code change. And that sucks, but in real life, that's actually what happens. And what happens a lot of the time is that snuck-in code change was put in on a debug setting, and they turned on debug logging, and then people think, oh, debug logging will save us. But the actual truth is just adding a log statement really quickly is what saved you, and debug logging just takes half the credit. Log rotation. I mean, I've seen a bunch of really weird log4j and logback files that configure log rotation in lovely esoteric ways. And in real life, this should be what log rotate's for. There's a lovely Unix utility called log rotate. It rotates your log files. Operations people are very smart, and they can rotate log files without the help of a shiny Java developer. And we just need to get over our egos. We're not the only people that can rotate a file. Although, actually, right now you can't, because log4j and logback and various other people actually break if you rotate a file because they hold handles to the old file and ruin everything. But they shouldn't. And configurable destinations in a bunch of different output formats, that's what logstash is for. You're using an elk stack, you've got logstash on the machine, you can transform anything into anything else, and it's all just going into, you know, Elasticsearch anyway. But even if it is going somewhere crazy, just do it in logstash. You've already got it. It's great at it. You know, why reinvent the wheel every time when there's a specialized tool already there? The really funny thing is, they're not developer friendly either, not these days, not the kind of development that I do. They have a completely separate configuration file, usually properties file format, if you're really lucky, XML, that are ugly. They use private static final variables, so they're lousy. They don't work with dependency injection frameworks like Juice or Spring. They don't do inversion of control. They're horrible to test with. Because they use private static final variables. And even if you do stuff with like test appenders or something so that you can kind of test what's in there, because it's not done dependency injection properly, those tests won't work when you run them in parallel, and a million just sort of stupid, fiddly things, and they're just not good to test with. They're not good to refactor with either. We've already covered this. And they don't have a bunch of features that you actually want. Like the number one feature, I always got asked when I was talking with people in operations, all right, so what do you need to maintain this system? Can you give me a list of everything that the app's going to log, why it's going to log it, and what should I do when I see it? I mean, it's not like you guys are asking for crazy things. You don't want it delivered to you in a limousine or something. You just say, what's it going to say, and what do I do when I see it? Simple stuff, but try doing that. Like, people come up with all these sort of crazy patterns, and you have to search through the code base, and when something comes up, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Even if they handle stack traces properly. Is anybody who here has ever trawled through a log file looking at a stack trace? Has anybody seen when two threads are writing a stack trace to the same file at the same time? So what happens is, a line at a time, you get one line from stack trace 1, and then one line from stack trace 2, and then the next line from stack trace 1, and the next line from stack trace 2. Has anybody ever tried to figure out what the root cause was of two exceptions that are different that got thrown at the same time? Was it fun? How about 3? Yeah, don't. It's impossible. It's horrible. Even things like, it would be really nice if it was easy to parse log messages. Like, I don't know, we're running low on disk space, there's a certain amount free. It'd be really great if you could just parse that message and figure out how much free disk space was actually there. And because your traditional log4j style libraries is just a string, I mean, how are you going to figure that out? Make it easy to search for log messages. About 10, 12 years ago now, there was a great book out called Release It by Michael Nygaard. Totally worth reading. And he had a bunch of really valuable tips, but one of the simplest ones that really stuck with me was, when you log, each log message should have a unique code. Just any kind of code, doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's unique. Because then if you want to find how many times that thing occurred, or if it's occurred, or when the last time it was occurred, you just search for the code. So that's the sort of thing that should be in logging libraries to help people do the right thing, and it's just nowhere. So I got tired of this enough times that I started sort of just wrapping this sort of pattern myself. And I ended up doing it 2 or 3 times, and ended up building a library. And the reason that happened was actually really weird, and oddly enough, the fault of the UK government. So Equal Experts does consulting work, so most of the time when I write something, I've been paid to write it. But usually also, when I've written something, it's the property of the people that paid me to write it in the first place. But I did a short-term contract through Equal Experts, well, a couple of months, through GDS, Government Digital Services. And for the 3rd or 4th time, we ran into this problem, and we wrote some code using a different pattern, a better way to do it. But GDS's default policy is that code the government writes is open source. So after they had paid me to write it, or us to write it, they let us take that part of the application out and convert it into a standalone library. And it wasn't sort of finished, it wasn't polished, there was a lot of work before it could become a standalone library. But they were very gracious and in fact encouraged us to do that. And it was really, really nice of them, because now we have a thing through multiple different authors, although many of them were me, that actually hopefully might try to sort of fix some of these problems. So it's both a way of dealing with operations, a library, and a pattern. And here's the pattern. The pattern is log with an enum instead of log with a string. And that means you can use it in any particular language. I've written this for Java 8, but if you've got .NET, this will still work. So you have a logger interface, an interface called log message, and then you need an enum that implements that interface. And so you have an enumeration of possible log messages, and each one gets a format string. So you have an enum of all the log messages. Each message has a unique code. Each message has a C-style format string. And to log, you take the enum value for the message you want to log and the arguments for the format string. And it's just that simple. But you end up with something like this. So in this particular case, each message has a timestamp, each message has a code, each message has a message. But let me just sort of show you what it looks like in practice. So, see if this works. All right, now this is the tricky part where I move IntelliJ over to the other window and magnify it and turn around so I'm not driving over my shoulder, because that just never works. So you start with a really simple interface and it's just get message code and get message pattern. And then you end up with a really dirty trick, which is that in Java, enums can implement interfaces. And so you have to write a slightly nasty constructor, but then you end up with an enumeration of log messages, such as, and these are ones from the original project that used this pattern the first time. So I successfully completed, here's a message, and I successfully published a bunch of records, and when you publish this message, you have to provide a value for this field. And there's a bunch of other messages here. But there's a couple of interesting things that you can probably see right away. And the first is that my IDE can tell me which messages are being used and which messages are not being used. It's very easy to spot dead code. The second is all the messages are grouped together. The third is, because there's a format string, it's really easy to see the structure of each particular message. I don't have to go to where it's being logged to know what's in this message, but I can. It's very easy for me to find out where this message is. And in fact, this one's being logged in a couple of different places. But here it is. So it looks something like that. You just log a message, go log, success, and the number of messages you've written. And it's as, that's, what else did I want to show you? Oh yeah. So I've shown you the log message interface, the Opslogger. The Opslogger interface is here. Yeah. So you basically have log a message, and a throwable. So here's my class that logs, and the interesting thing is the logger is injected via constructor injection just like any other dependency. It's not special anymore. And that means it's really easy to test. So you just have a mock logger and you use verify methods on it. So if you want to say I should have logged an unknown error message whenever something unexpected happens, it's just a regular old unit test. One of the things we did though is we built a fairly high quality test double. And so what it does is when you pass a bunch of arguments in, it will do the format string to make sure that the arguments match the format string, but it doesn't actually send the message anywhere. So that if you're doing something grossly inappropriate at test time, it'll actually check that for you. And the weird irony of that is it makes runtime a bit more performant, because if you've got tests, we don't actually have to do that check at runtime, although we still can. When you have this messages class, there's some things you want to have here, such as all these codes being unique. And we actually wrote a contract test that, and the one thing I didn't do, I didn't compile. Hold on a second. I upgraded to IntelliJ 15 yesterday, and it re-import. Come on, baby. Yay. Okay, so when I run this test, it does a number of the common checks that you would want to do for you, such as for each message, it should be immutable. The message shouldn't be an empty string. The message code shouldn't be null. Each message should be unique. All your message codes should be of the same length. It's all the common stuff that you want to do here. We just wrote a contract test for you, so you don't have to write the test. You just it'll tell you if you've made a mistake. If I accidentally make two messages the same, I'll know, and I don't have to worry about it. So we're enforcing all the unique properties for you with nice, halfway decent error messages as well. So these two have the same message. The same code. You should fix it. just sort of little stuff that actually helps the developer experience a little bit. And one of the coolest things we can do is, because these enums all implement an interface and they're all handy, my Gradle build can generate documentation as part of its build cycle. So if I run the build task, it will actually generate documentation, and it's just really simple documentation. And where has it gone? Oh, would help if I opened the right build folder. Simple documentation. Here in this enum are all the messages and what they mean, which makes it really, really easy to build a runbook. Now this is simple, straightforward, poorly formatted text right now, but you can see how it's very easy to turn this into a wiki or whatever else, and you can diff these files between builds to see if something's changed. So just small little things that in sort of our experience have helped a little bit. Now, back to, where's my cursor? Come on. There it is. So yeah, as I said, GDS, as part of the gov.uk initiative, was sort of paid us to write some of the initial source code and then donated it to, well, to us in the world. So it's very nice. So I always like to give them a little thank you. So the library we wrote, it's open source. It's fairly opinionated. One of the things that's not in it is debug levels, because we don't think that they're particularly useful. One of the things that's not in it is automatic log rotation, because we don't think it's particularly useful. It's not configurable to death. You can configure it, but we try not to have a billion options that you can just fall under. Simple output. It's easy to read. It's easy to parse. There are no transitive dependencies. It requires Java 8. Java 7 has been EOL'd since about April 2015. It's almost a year. If you want it done in Java 6 or Java 7, pay us to do it. I think that's fair. Testability is a big part of this library. It's built for testability from the ground up, not just testing itself, but testing applications that use it, so that you can prove that you're logging the right things at the right times and that nothing untoward is happening there. Like I said, we've written a special test double that you should use in your tests. It's generally mocking framework agnostic. As long as you've got spies, it works great with Mockito. We've got contract tests that run off of your Java enumerations for you, so that you can test a bunch of your infrastructure that uses this library. They always use injections, so it works with Spring, it works with Juice. We've tested it with Dagger. You know, the idea is it should use whatever you're using to build your application or to bootstrap your application already. You can just inject instances yourself if you're doing your own thing. It's very straightforward. It's configurable through code. Although I did actually check, if you're one of the few people that still uses Spring XML, you can do it there as well, but you don't need to. Just use code. As I showed you, it can automatically generate documentation. One of the features that I think is really cool is it's log rotate friendly, and we've done something called active rotation support. Java loggers have a real problem that they hold file handles, but they don't lock directory entries, which means that if you move the file, it won't stop you from moving the file, but it'll keep writing to the old file instead of the new file. And so what we do is we have the facility for you to tell the logging framework, I'm rotating files, and when it returns from that call, it will guarantee to you that it's dropped every handle to the old file. So you basically just move the files, say, I'm moving the files, and by the time it gives you the thumbs up, it's definitely safe to compress or delete or do whatever to the old file, because it will have definitely stopped writing to it, which is not something you can do with Log4j. It's not something you can do with log rotate. And that's actually why they do a lot of their own rotation, because they were too lazy to do this right, because it's a lot of work, actually. It's reasonably easy to parse with Logstash. One of the things I want to do is to make it very easy to parse with Logstash. We do some cool things with stack trace handling. Right now, there's a configurable setting you can turn on that if you've got a stack trace, one of the things I hate about stack traces when you've got two of them in a file at once. So first of all, that never happens because we buffer the stack trace. Stack traces are always written in order. They're never, ever, ever munged. But that's still actually pretty sucky because rule number one for a nice readable log line is it should just be one line. And stack traces are the thing that kind of ruins that. And so one of the things we can do is if you're logging a stack trace, it'll output the stack trace to a file and just put the name of the file in the log message. And the really cool thing is that the name of the file is done by the MD5 hash of the stack trace, which means if you're logging the same stack trace over and over and over again, which happens sometimes with performance problems, it dedupes the file for you. And better than that, you can see how many times the one stack trace happens in your file by just counting the number of times you see the one MD5 hash. And so you don't have to do that. If you're logging to an elk stack, you might want to disable that because you want everything in Elasticsearch. But depending on what kind of infrastructure you're using, that's sometimes a nice feature. So, you know, just a lot of sort of things like that that have been driven out of conversations with people in operations and sort of, you know, deployment sort of land. And that leads me to the last question, which is does this give anybody any ideas? Is there anything here that you want to see? Matthew. Could do.
I really like the idea with having that identification for different types. And I think in .NET, if you use existing kind of iLogger and log4net and you write extensions, instead of Enum's extensions for interface, and one of the extensions will be success. And every time you use that extension, the method in that extension to write success instead of using Enum's as a.
It's probably doable in .NET. I mean, Enum's and.
I was using this technique in 2007. A big system for financial organizations in the city. So it's amazing to see all this stuff here.
I don't like.
This is really close to my heart.
I've run into a bunch of people who are like, oh yeah, at least you wrapped it in enumeration, right? Like it seems to come up again and again and again, and no one ever sort of just encapsulated that into a library that you could just use to save everybody the trouble. I think it's probably been independently invented or discovered probably a couple of dozen times by people who just really want, and they do it for different reasons. Some people really want to do it, make it testable. Some people really, really want to make it sort of documentable, and it kind of seems to do all of them. I mean, I really stumbled into this because I've got a colleague named Chris who practices this rule that if he sees a line of code that he can delete without making a test fail, he does it just to see what happens. And it's fantastic because it raises chaos and you just have to test everything. And so I started, well, how do I test this to stop you from deleting it? And we sort of figured out this pattern. But there's, no matter how you get into it, people tend to do the same sort of pattern over and over again. I'm pretty sure you could do it in .NET. Hi.
I think, well, I'd just like to say, having spent most of my career as an operations person, this is just magic to see some who's implementing some of the common sense things from ops around how you handle logging and what you do in logging and log-related scenarios. I would observe that despite having asked numerous times over the last 15 years for a list of log messages and some text around what the developer means by writing that log message, I've never ever succeeded in getting done with what those logs.
And the reason is genuinely either the developer's lazy, but assuming that that's not the case, and it probably isn't the case, the reason is because the tools that they have pushed upon them by like the Java community as a whole make that really difficult. It's not that they don't want to. Some of them might not want to, but even if you do want to, it's just hard. People do crazy stuff. Michael Nygaard was saying that this was back in 2004, you could use Eclipse's internationalization plugin to move all the log messages to a properties file or something lame like that. But people have tried various hacks over the years, and the tools don't make it easy enough. So it's great that you like this sort of documentation.
I think the bit that has often gone missing is understanding within the development team that as a group of operations people, when we look at log messages, we want to be able to see the way the system's behaving over time. So we can read logs really quickly because you're doing it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the last 5 to 10 years, this has gotten a lot easier for me because in the early 2000s, like everybody else, the debug log messages were for me. And these days, now that I do proper TDD and now that I've got proper IDE and a self-contained system, these days if I want to know what the system is doing, I run my bloody unit tests in a debugger. And that's, to me now, the gold standard of am I writing enough unit tests? If I can figure out what the system's doing by running a unit test in a debugger, that's what's for me now. The logging is now entirely for operations, and I think that's the way it should be. And as soon as it's only serving one audience or one potential use case or user as opposed to two, I think everything gets better. And maybe people who are writing crazy embedded stuff, still need a bit of that. But for web apps these days, no, you don't. And I think that'll really help. One of the things I want to see is I want to change the documentation so instead of plain text, it's JSON or something so that it's easier to transform, so that as part of your continuous delivery pipeline, you can actually just sort of actually get it into something. I mean, that's human readable, but it wasn't exactly pretty. But if it was JSON, we could sort of transform it and turn it into an actual reasonably well-formatted runbook, just sort of automatically. And to me, the dream is your Jenkins job, you can download the, for any particular build, you can just download the operations manual like right off of your continuous integration server. Anything else? Cool, guys. Oh, sorry.
Thinking about that debug levels,
Mm-hmm.
logging levels.
Yeah.
Why not?
Why not?
Why not?
Why not debug levels?
Yeah.
Because the 3 reasons, they don't actually help in production. We covered that more or less to death.
Can you compare? Because I find I'm DevOps, so I don't
Yeah.
exist first of all, but I do both of it.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, when you look for a correlation in when something crashes,
Mhm.
sometimes debug levels help.
Well, my counterpoint is, having spent most of my career in finance, turning on debug was often too late.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
so it didn't actually help.
Debug is a very, very ugly
Or
word.
performance
In general,
Yeah.
logging levels.
Yeah, so log everything all the time, right? Keep some of it for short periods of time, keep some of it for long periods of time. That's what your elk stack's for, right? The point is, even if you want different levels of severity, this is an important thing, this is a less important thing, they should all be on all the time. Because, as has been said, you can't turn them on, like in the middle of a problem. That's not going to help. And if it is going to help, you're doing continuous delivery to the point where you just add another one. Yeah.
That's what we do. So we have log
Yeah.
levels, but we send all of them out.
Yeah.
Elk will just filter them out anyway. You can say, oh, it's going to see debug at this period of time.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really actually matter on the other side. But
Yeah.
I guess if you're looking into log files, it might be a bit of an issue. I don't know what your setup is.
Yeah, I agree that in finance it's too late. But like, if you took into account like from a consumer point of view, I mean like on a phone, when I click this button, sorry, for one client, when I click this button, it fails every time. Everybody works but for this particular phone, when I click the button, so you want to see the stack, for example, and because I think that is so opinionated, you can't have like debugging levels.
Okay, so hold on a second. So what, you want to see a stack trace? Because, I mean, we log stack traces.
Yeah, but I don't want to log it every time. I want to log it when, like...
So you want, so the really weird thing is you want a different conditional logging. You don't want only log debug. You want only log it if it happens for customer number 347. So you actually want a different conditional anyway that's not in the framework, right? And so really probably what you want is to log it for all customers, and then if it correlates with, so basically if you include the current customer number or the current username in every log message, you can figure out, just show me all the messages for, this user number 347,
Yeah,
and then
I
it's
want
there.
to
Yeah.
every single customer, but all the time.
Yeah. Well, so
Once when it happened,
what
I
you
know it happened.
well, what you want is for it to always be on and to be able to filter really well.
why don't you want it on all the time, just out of curiosity?
Why would they have it? Like,
Because you can. Because
Yeah,
what
yeah,
we do
you
is,
can, yeah.
that's exactly what, so we would do it all the time, we have trace IDs.
Yeah.
Every single time a customer requests something, and if it breaks, it comes up with a trace ID. Say, go, this is the trace ID, call up customer support, this is my trace ID. And you get straight to that log.
Yeah.
But at the same time, no one had to turn anything on because it's already there.
And worse, what if they call up and say, this has been breaking for the last 3 weeks? right? You can't go back in time and turn it on for 3 weeks ago, but what you can do is, if you've been logging it the whole time, is look for instances in the last 3 weeks where you get this kind of exception. So one of the things I didn't mention that a lot of logging libraries do, and this is one of them, is sort of diagnostic context for a log, like correlators. So in particular, a trace ID, a request ID, the current username. So you can set it up to log those things, and they're not really sort of configurable so much as they are per application with every request. So that if you have a user ID, we'll log the user ID with every request, which makes it really easy to filter if you know which user it is. You can look up their user ID and then see only the log messages that came from them. And in Kibana, that would really easily drill down to your problem very quickly. Now, to be fair, that you could do that with most any sort of logging framework, but what you don't need in that situation is the ability to turn debug logging on, because if you have 250,000 customers, you are not going to get an engineering request in to restart your 75 server cluster with debug on while you're on the phone with them in time to get a debug message out on their call. You'll have had to already record it and then just change your filtering. And the good news is that's what the elk stack's for, and it's really easy to change your, to do sort of ad hoc filtering and ad hoc querying.
Like, first of all, I really like to leave somewhere behind this debug, because debug is not especially for ops. I agree with that.
Fine, info.
Okay, but in general, in my company where we use logging levels, not debug levels, is that, for example, you can pass some very important customer data to the actual elk because of FCA authority audit or stuff like that. And you need to have a place when you will say that, okay, these logs are needed in any kind of twisted exception or stuff like that, but they should never be visible for the actual ops guys. Because, and on the other hand, we want ops guys to be able to do whatever they want with their elk, in this case Kibana. So they want to make this kind of board, take Kibana, do what you want. But still...
So you've got files, so you've got some log messages that are too sensitive for your operations team to see, and they're on a disk on your production server, but maybe across 25 production servers, and the sensitive lines containing information that you can't let people see for regulatory reasons, and the non-sensitive lines that everybody should look at, are interleaved in the same file, and you're going to have to then log on to the production server, which contains this secret information, in order to even look at it when you're not in operations. Well, you're in sort of DevOps. It's sort of a mix of the very paranoid and the very, very lax, but I'm not saying it's not a valid use case for you, but I think it's not a valid use case for a lot of people.
Add to that, Journal D, AWS, proxying actually between Elasticsearch and Journal D, and you will get where I am.
Well, so I can't solve everything. What I would say, though, is that one of the things you can do or should do with Logstash, and possibly a good elk stack, is have permissions for different kind of log messages. So what I would, if it was me designing that kind of situation where there was some information that, say, only senior operations staff could see but not everybody, is that different codes, and now we've got codes, so it's really easy to filter, that some different codes were associated with different permissions levels, and you secure your elk stack so it's still in the elk stack and the contents of your elk stack are privileged, but different people have different read access to the elk stack, and you just sort of configure it that way. And then again, you still probably want to log everything, but you might have different retention periods because it's regulatory, and that's fine, and different security levels for what you can query and who can query it when. I can see, that's never been my use case. I can see that you would have that use case.
And I agree, and I had exactly the same talk with audit guys from FCA. They told me that when you need to somehow know, for example, via message code, how will you be able to fetch that exact message code? So like regex or stuff like that, any kind of manipulation of text. What if something crashes? For example, out of nowhere, I don't know, space vibes or something, your message codes become corrupted, encoding changes, or anything else, you would like you would want to be able to filter out as low as possible on the lowest of possible levels. If you already put something into text and manipulating it.
So you would implement that in Logstash. And the other answer I give you is that that stuff's not going to happen with the codes because we tested it now. We've got unit tests and we know that that stuff's there and that stuff's working, and I can actually prove it to you that under a stress test and a load test in any reasonable situation that won't happen. It sounds like you've got a very specific use case, and if that's the case, this may not be the library for you, and that's actually fine. There are cases where people really need that stuff. But for your sort of traditional e-commerce style web apps, I think that this has a lot of advantages. I see a lot of ops people that are happy, and that makes me happy. So parting thoughts, the usual canards, there's no such thing as a non-functional requirement. There's a functional requirement for a user you're ignoring. Operators are users. Operators may be the users. As operators, be as involved in the acceptance process as you can. Foster collaboration, not negotiation. This is going to be difficult because developers can be pricks. A lot has changed in the last 15 years. 16 years ago now is when Log4j got first released to the public. A lot has changed in that time. Yesterday's tools are not necessarily the right tools for tomorrow's applications. Don't let developers get away with thinking that operations is exactly like development, but different. And thanks so much for your time and your comments.